Hi, and welcome to Whitley Penn Talks. My name is John Williamson. I am a partner in our firm's risk advisory services practice. For those of you that aren't as familiar with this group, we specialize in internal control and cybersecurity related matters. I often like to put it this way when talking to our clients. If the subject matter has to do with internal controls, processes, technology, or compliance, then that is at the heart of what we do. Before we go any further in today's topic, I'd like to introduce someone that we've had on the podcast before, Jesus Vega. He's our senior manager in our practice and also our cybersecurity SME. How are you, Jesus?
Good, thank you, John.
Now, Jesus is a CISSP. It's a fantastic credential that Jesus has spent years working on, and essentially that allows him to be kind of the tech guy out of the two of us. So, so today we're going to talk to a couple of things that we've been seeing in the media and in the news. I think that we are all aware that over the past decade, cybersecurity has skyrocketed to become one of the most omnipresent and pernicious risks out there in the world. We've seen a lot of recent breaches hit the headlines. We're going to walk through some of those today. Jesus is going to tell us kind of what happened, and some of the vulnerabilities and issues that led to those breaches. And then we're also going to discuss third-party risk and how we might manage those things. Before we get to that, I do want to present just a few numbers to you just to illustrate the point of how important this risk is and how large cybercrime is as an industry. There's widely publicized data breaches that have become mainstream in our news cycle. Currently, cybercrime accounts for approximately 1% of global GDP. And if you think about it, that's currently larger than the economy of the entire state of Texas. It's on par with Spain and Mexico. It's larger than Turkey, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Cybercriminals on average get paid over $2 million a year for cybercrime, so clearly they're good at their job. They are better paid than a lot of us, yours included. And also they reinvest their profits and almost think of it as like retained earnings within their business. So it really is a mature industry and a mature business. It's clear to see why hackers are so motivated to commit the crimes that they do. Now, as we move to the actual breaches themselves, I first would like to start with Solarwinds. The Solarwinds is one that I think we've heard a lot about. I remember hearing a news story in December of 2020, and for the first time, a breach of this nature was so widely publicized, in particular by the federal government, that I remember the government issuing a statement to the public saying, hey guys, this one is really bad. You should really take a look at this. So, Jesus, why don't you walk us through the SolarWinds breach, and maybe if you can start by telling us what is SolarWinds?
Yeah, definitely. SolarWinds is a tool that a lot of companies use to monitor their infrastructure, their resources, and the ability of those companies providing services to the clients. SolarWinds has expanded to additional services. They have online help desk solutions, and they have a plethora of tools. However, they were known for monitoring services. It's a great tool. I'm personally familiar with SolarWinds, and I liked it. However, they became a victim, as so many other companies. And interesting, you mentioned that the news of this broke in December, because this has a very interesting timeline. The bad guys, the perpetrators, initially gained access to a 365 email account back in February of 2020. So this was not a overnight attack SolarWinds experience. This was something that took time. It was planned out. It was meticulous. After the facts, and SolarWinds brought in FireEye, and they had all these companies come and help out and figure out how to remediate, how to fix it. They started discovering that this happened over a single 365 account. So let's take that into consideration. An employee's email account was hijacked by bad guys. How was it hijacked? We don't have a definitive answer. There's speculations it could have been phishing attack, or some credential phishing email, which is similar. Basically means somebody gets an email saying, hey, log into this website to retrieve a file, but that source of that email is a bad email. And when you input your credentials, the bad guys now have access to that. This could have easily been mitigated if multi-factor authentication had been enabled for that account. It seems that wasn't the case. Once these bad guys were inside the 365 space, they were able to gain a foothold on additional 365 accounts. After they had obtained those 365 accounts, they started logging into the SolarWinds internal tools and deploying code to the virtual servers, where they ended up preparing the malware they were going to deploy to the client. So notice that I'm focusing on how the bad guys gained entry to SolarWinds. I haven't even discussed the fact that they started deploying code into the SolarWinds environment. SolarWinds was maintaining operations. They were doing the data operations, where they were focusing on how to develop their tools. In March, they released a patch for the tool that was the culprit of this attack. That's called Orion. And this tool was used by a lot of clients. The bad guys were so bold that they deployed the code to multiple virtual machines in the SolarWinds environment. SolarWinds pushed out the patch to their clients in March. And in June, the bad guys went back and removed that code from those virtual machines in an attempt to cover their steps. So it seems that this patch was out there for a while. Now, it came to light in an interesting manner. FireEye, which is a company known for sandboxing, which is network protection. They also have Mandiant as part of their business, which is a company that usually goes and investigates frauds. They also do penetration tests. They discovered that somebody had stolen their pen testing tools, the Red Team's proprietary software. Upon investigating, they realized that the attack was perpetrated by SolarWinds. That's where they noticed that there was something off. So FireEye, being a company that specializes in security, having a team that specializes in incident recovery, they immediately discovered this because we saw that the event happened on December 8th, where FireEye's penetration tools were stolen. By December 12th, a few days later, FireEye was notifying SolarWinds, your tool has been compromised. This unfortunately turned into SolarWinds having to file an AK on the secretary of the SEC. Mm-hmm. And their stocks just took a pummel. They went from $23.55 down to $14.18, basically overnight. And currently they're still lagging at $11.13. This was as of yesterday when I researched this number. But this shows that how your vendors grade a risk to your company. This vendor, FireEye, was using SolarWinds to monitor their environment, and bad guys went in and stole proprietary equipment. The SolarWinds folks doing the operations of day-to-day, maintaining the software, released a patch, and they didn't know that their system had been compromised through a 365 email account. So those are the facts. Now we can dive into how this happened on what I think happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you first, Jesus. So, one of the first things that you said really struck me, which is that they think that the attack originated earlier in 2020, perhaps March, April, May, sometime in the second quarter, right? But it wasn't discovered until December. Which seems like it's a common theme that we hear in these breaches, is that often, someone's environment is compromised and the bad guys essentially remain there undetected for months at a time. What kinds of things can we do to try to more timely detect this type of thing so that we don't have people sitting within our environment monitoring us compromised for an extended period of time?
So, John, you stole my segue into conversation.
Yeah.
So I wanted to discuss how what we can do to prevent this. It's taking actions that are making hard for accounts to be taken over. If we take a step back from the beginning, this whole nightmare for SolarWinds started over at 365, an email account being hijacked. How was the account hijacked is not clear. It's not that we don't have a definitive answer. Mandiant and all the researchers didn't find conclusive evidence. My speculation is that the account was taken over somebody's not having multi-factor authentication enabled, and maybe being rushed and responding to an email next to clicking on something. I think everybody who hears this podcast has received some sort of spam, either to be training, educational, or actual spam. The difference is sometimes this is targeted, and when it is targeted, they tend to be crafted. With social media, LinkedIn, etc., it's easy to write up an email and target specific individuals with the intent to lure them into providing their passwords. Even if you have a targeted person, if you have multi-factor authentication in your email accounts, that account might have not been compromised.
Is it with 365 accounts? Is it simply like flipping a switch to enable multi-factor authentication in 365? Is that something that comes with 365?
365 is built into it. It's very simple. Intune, which is the admin console for 365, has the capability just to flip a switch. Unfortunately, it tends to be more cultural that people do not want to have multi-factor because I don't want to get a text message or a app on my phone that pops up with, is this really you? Because the answer is going to be always yes. That is a mentality that I see across the industry. There's pushback on the multi-factor. But most organizations that employ multi-factor authentication tend to do better in security postures, and they can avoid these type of scenarios.
Now, one other thing, Jesus, you mentioned Solarwinds is a pretty widely used product. I know you probably don't have the exact answer in front of you, but how many companies that we work with use a Solarwinds product?
So that's an interesting number because the numbers that I have from SolarWinds is that approximately 18,000 SolarWinds clients receive the patch with the bad code. The experts believe that there was about 1,000 of those who actively saw traffic on the network between their client side and the bad guys' side. Out of those 1,000 companies that experienced the malicious code pinged to the command and controls, and those who just had the bad patch and didn't actually the bad guys didn't activate it, we don't know because SolarWinds really deployed quickly a patch to how to fix it, and the clients that we do have that had SolarWinds were very reactionary, or some of them, and I quote, some of our clients, we hadn't patched to that level yet because they were waiting. So
this is a case of somebody delaying on applying a patch, and it actually worked out in their favor.
Yes, even though the patch was released in March and they didn't patch for the year.
Yeah, that's funny. That's normally the opposite of what we tell our clients, is we want them to stay on top of those. Jesus, so with SolarWinds, and to be clear, it's just the Orion product that was compromised. But I've read that SolarWinds posted some statistics on their customers. This was, of course, before the breach. They took it down as soon as the breach went public. But SolarWinds customers included 425 of the U.S. Fortune 500, the top 10 U.S. telecom companies in the world, all branches of the U.S. military, the Pentagon, and the State Department. And if you look at that client list of organizations that use SolarWinds, or at least did, then it becomes kind of scary to think that this third-party product that we're all using and is plugged into our network could have released malicious code within our environment.
There's a couple of things that to consider there. So when it comes to SolarWinds or any third-party solution out there, there's two approaches of how to deploying it. These companies are widely known. They have far reach just to the organizations you mentioned, but also to small businesses, medium-sized businesses. And the number of customers that receive the infected version of is 18,000. That's just the clients that actually had the Orion on-prem, which they were not using SolarWinds cloud project tools. So they have a really big hold on the infrastructure as a whole in the United States. So that said, what is usually surprising, and this is my speculation, we have the tendency to deploy in the path of least resistance. SolarWinds and a bunch of other tools out there have best practices, and these are the type of admin rights that we need. They typically are elevated permissions, almost administrator level, but not quite. They have ability to read and get data off systems, but that requires a specific configuration because those types of roles are not built into the system. So organizations tend to deploy with administrator rights because it's the path of least resistance. So some organizations, if they would have done their due diligence and determined what specific role the accounts would need to be created, they might have been able to prevent the SolarWinds tool that was in their environment to take control of those systems that they were monitoring.
So, so that's SolarWinds. Is there any other points you wanted to highlight for that one, Jesus?
Not for SolarWinds, no.
Well, so then if we may, then I'd like to move on to our next breach that we'd like to cover. I think this one, in speaking with my clients, this one hit close to home for a lot of them and got a lot of people spooked, and that's the Colonial Pipeline attack. Now, I think most of us know what this attack was. In May of 2021, the pipeline, which provides approximately 45% of oil and gasoline to the East Coast, suffered a ransomware attack. And the pipeline found itself in a very difficult position of paying the ransom or trying to recover on its own. So, Jesus, if you can, walk us through this one. Maybe give us a little bit of detail on what the pipeline is and how the attack was perpetrated.
So the pipeline is a fuel line that transports nearly half of the East Coast fuel supplies from refineries, mostly in Texas, up to the East Coast. And the way that this happened, this is what has been published, is that around April, toward the end of April, hackers were able to get access to the system through a VPN account. This VPN account, the password for this account was found in the dark web. Once these hackers were inside the environment, they were able to attack the administrator's network. What that means is they didn't go into the specific network where they had all the tool and the equipment that ran the pipeline. They went more toward the office equipment, like the personnel, the accountants, the front office people, because the back end or the system that runs all the tools for the pipeline tend to be isolated, or they're kind of clustered in their own isolated section by design. However, the front office had that remote connectivity established, and what seems to be the case is that the password that was used for the VPN account was found in the dark web from a different source. What that means is that the password that the bad guys found was a user's reused password, meaning that they didn't have unique passwords for the tools. So if a user goes and creates a Facebook account and has password 1 as a password, and then they go into the company assets and set the same password 1 as their credentials, then if Facebook lost their passwords, then bad guys can go and say, well, we have the email for this account. Let's try it and see if this password works. And in the case of the Colonial Pipeline, it did work. The Colonial Pipeline incident has been not too widely disclosed on how it happened for obvious reasons. The Colonial company has been a little bit shy of saying, yes, we made a mistake. The investigators have been putting in information. The data that I've seen is that the accounting system was attacked and it was brought down. The pipeline itself was unable to document the amount of gasoline that it was distributing to the clients, and in an effort not to lose account of all the sales that we're doing, they decided to hold, processing any more sales until they realized until they were able to recover because they could invoice their clients. They were also unsure if the attack had migrated over, so there was a safety concern too.
Yeah, that's normally the most difficult part, right? Is if we are hit with a ransomware attack, we know that a part of our environment is infected with the malware. It's just difficult to ascertain the extent of the damage and to know what systems are truly affected, right? So in this particular case, for the Colonial Pipeline, if they realized that some of their system had been impacted, then instead of risking the whole thing coming down, they decided to go ahead and cut it off at the beginning.
Yes, they wanted to validate that the operations network was not affected, which makes total sense, since that equipment, if it's put into usage to non-safe levels, it could cause accidents, and it's just it would become a nightmare scenario. But also on the business side, they had to stop because they couldn't account for anything, since all that side of the house was done. So as a business, how can they sell a product and not keep track of who they're selling, who they're distributing to? So it was a attack that affected one portion of the network, but it basically brought down the whole business.
So the ransom paid, 75 Bitcoin, was approximately $4.4 million. Can you tell us what's the wisest course of action if you've been hit with a ransomware attack? Is it best just to pay the ransom, or should you try to recover on your own?
So the answer that we should give our listeners is always have good backups. You don't have to find yourself in that position. The Colonial Pipeline had to make the decision of, do we pay or do we use our backups? Or our backups are not available because they were in the same network. Then the attack happened, so those backups were tainted by that attack. So if they would have had their backups in an isolated place, such as a cloud provider or something along those lines, they would have not had to answer questions. Now, the direct answer to your question is, ideally, it's not a good idea to pay the bad guys, because you won't have any guarantee you're going to get the key to unlock your systems back. You can hope you get it back. Some bad guys might be honest. I'm trying to make a sarcastic face here, but you don't really know if you're going to get it paid. Get the key to unlock your systems. And if you get your key to unlock, will they come back for you more often? It's one of those questions that it's easy to be a Monday night quarterback and say, yes, they should, or no, you shouldn't. However, your business needs to make that decision. The other thing I would add is make sure you have your backups in a safe, secure location. That way you don't have to find yourself in that predicament.
Yeah, and always, I think I frequently hear this, that when it comes to ransomware attacks, you're only as good as your latest backup, and you need to be pretty sure that data is recoverable and readable. I think most of us don't want to encourage a criminal enterprise and continue paying the bad guys money, but sometimes it simply is a business decision.
Yeah.
So there's the Colonial Pipeline. Let's move on to our last attack that we're going to discuss, which is the Microsoft Exchange attack. So, Jesus, maybe you can start with just telling us what an Exchange server is, and how this affects. Does it affect everyone that uses Microsoft email services, or just a smaller portion of the population?
So we need to start by differentiating the types of email services that Microsoft provides. The first one is the traditional on-premise email service, which you have a server that's hosting your inboxes. That server is either located in your co-location or your dedicated space. Typically, smaller companies would buy an Exchange server and install it on their environment, which would be on-prem. The 365 is email as a service, which is basically you log into a website and everything's there, maintained by Microsoft. In this particular instance, the affected versions of Exchange was everything that was on premise from 2010 all the way to 2019. So the servers, if you had a physical server, or virtualized for that matter, in your environment, you were prone to this. This was a 0 day that was discovered. 0 day means that there was a bug that has been unseen before, and either by a person who is testing typically referred to as a white hacker or somebody with malicious intent, black hacker, a black hat hacker. They came upon this and then they realized that this exploit was actively exploited. It's speculated that it was by the Chinese, where they would deploy a shell into the Exchange server. This web shell, what it provided was the ability to somebody to remote into that server, open a command line, and start executing code at an administrator level. So this bypass of security the Exchange had was really a bypass of security, because it allowed people to connect remotely and basically steal your email server, which in essence is all your reset passwords and all these other tools that we associate with email. So Microsoft put out a patch for this and included what they had deemed end of life, the 2010 Exchange server. But this was we don't know how long it was in the wild. The fact that they provided patches for a 2010 Exchange server means that it's been there for quite some time. So the fact that it was made public when they put out the announcement that they had this patch is when the amount of exploitations just took off. According to the Wall Street Journal, there's an estimated that about 250,000 companies were the victims of this attack. And Microsoft 365 clients were fortunately spared this instance.
So in this particular case, 365 users not impacted, but if you had the on-premise version of Exchange, then you most likely were impacted. And Microsoft has released updates and patches to fix the issue.
Microsoft released a patch, out of the cycle, which means that Microsoft puts their patches every Tuesday, third Tuesday of the month, or second Tuesday of the month. And this was a urgent patch for all their supported versions, including the 2010, which was not supported. That basically means Microsoft said at one point, Exchange 2010 is no longer supported by us because it's end of life, move on to a new version of it. Mm-hmm. However, they knew that some of the clients were still on it, and they provided that patch for that.
So this is a case of timely applying the patch is actually working in your favor. So just to be clear, that when it comes to cyber hygiene, patch management is pretty important to stay on top of.
Patch management is one of the best tools you can have to remediate security concerns.
Well, very good, Jesus. So that was very helpful going through those 3 attacks. Now, a few things that we want to discuss. Some of these issues, it's pretty clear that attackers can take advantage of third-party relationships to compromise other organizations. As we've gotten to a business environment where we're outsourcing more and more to third parties, this introduces an element of risk that we probably weren't dealing with 10 to 20 years ago. I want to just kind of focus for a moment on what we might do to manage these vendor relationships and hopefully prevent or more timely detect our environment being compromised because of these vendor relationships. So maybe you can tell us, how are attackers using these third-party relationships to take advantage of us, and what are the things that we can do to protect ourselves?
So it's a difficult question to answer in the next 20 minutes because it's a whole subject by itself. But I can premise the following. Vendors can be your best friend or a nightmare. What I mean with that is when you have a third-party solution such as 365, if you set it up correctly, it could be it land on your best friend column. Let's go back to SolarWinds. They have 365 as their email. They didn't deploy it with multi-factor authentication. If they had deployed it, most likely, or the SolarWinds breach would have not happened. Then you have a vendor whose risk has been transferred. For example, the Exchange server on premise, we had a risk of that physical component in your environment. So you transfer the risk over to the vendor. You configure it according to their best practices, which includes enabling multi-factor authentication, so you can rely on that. Now, if you use a third party and you don't configure it correctly, then it falls into a nightmare scenario, which is more or less what happened to SolarWinds. They didn't deploy according to Microsoft best practices, and it became an issue. The relationship with third party is always a finicky one because you have to be mindful of all the different moving parts. If we go back to the Colonial attack, it happened through a VPN. The VPN connection, let's assume for a second that the VPN connection was for a vendor, because the Target hack that happened many years ago, that's exactly what happened. It was a Target slash HVAC vendor who had a VPN connection for the vendor to use, connect to their system and monitoring those delicate equipment. So the VPN tool that they had, was it a vendor specific one? I couldn't find any specific answer on that response, where if it was needed for a vendor, if it was the clients to the users to connect from home. All we know is that it was an inactive VPN account, that the password was found in the dark web. So vendor management, knowing what needs to be set up. Okay, we're going to have remote connectivity with your vendors. We need to know who's going to be using it. We would encourage strong password, but we can always mitigate a weak password with a multi-factor authentication. And then obviously keep those vendors appraised by having some sort of reviews or anything like that.
You know what's odd, Jesus, is I think when we do work for our clients, I'll frequently encounter situations where where our clients aren't managing their vendors the same way that they would their own employees. They may grant their vendors administrative credentials to their environment. They may be shared accounts, and they don't necessarily know who has those accounts and passwords. And it's almost like vendors get a special exemption sometimes. So I suppose one of the lessons we can take away from that is even though it's a third party or it's someone that you're not responsible for directly supervising, it doesn't mean that risk goes away or that you should really treat them any differently than one of your own employees.
That is correct. I mean, when we were talking earlier about SolarWinds, I mentioned that the installation of their tools in your environment might require some elevated permissions. However, the IT administrators tend to take the path of least resistance and give them the administrator level, which is the easiest way to set it up. Unfortunately, vendors get that treatment all the time, and users are given the least amount of access needed. So there's a disconnect. The process is there. Companies do it all the time. You're an accountant, you're going to get access to the accounting files, and that's it. You're an IT person, you're going to get access to the IT systems, but we're going to lock you out of the HR stuff. It's there. It's just not done. Why is it not done? Is it the IT person having a million tasks to complete that day? Is it cultural? Is it just because the vendor will still charge time? It's one of those, specific to your organization. You need to determine what is it that you need to do. I would just encourage everybody takes a look at those vendor accounts and make sure that they're appropriately set up.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. If I may add that also, a lot of what we encourage our clients to do when it comes to vendor management, perform an annual risk assessment to evaluate your vendors, how critical they are to you, and what their security obligations are to you as their customer. Part of what we recommend is read through the contract language that you have with your vendors. It's really important to identify what service level agreements are in place, what their commitments are, and to keep them accountable. But also, let's not forget that you're accountable to perform certain things as well to maintain the security of that relationship. We sometimes will get asked by our clients, hey, we think that our vendor's not performing, or we think that there may be some internal control issues that is increasing our risk exposure at a particular vendor. Can you come help us? Well, without a right to audit in that contract, it becomes very difficult. So I'd recommend that when you draft contracts with vendors that you include some language related to information security, particularly for sensitive data, ensuring that they have a minimum set or standard of controls in place, and that you've got some contractual right to go review their records and have access to their information so that you can monitor whether they are performing against their contract. One other thing that I want to highlight as well is, so SOC reports are generally a way for customers to have some level of assurance on how controls are being performed at vendors. These reports were formerly known as SAS 70 reports. They were originally generated in the context of a financial statement audit. If a financial statement audit client was relying on a third party, a vendor, to process transactions on their behalf, then a SAS 70, then later known as SOC report, came into play. Essentially, the concept is very simple. A CPA firm will perform an examination on a service organization, in particular, their controls over either transactional processing or information security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. That report then gets distributed by the vendor to all of their customers. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that it's a silver bullet, but it is a really useful way for vendors to be held accountable, but also to demonstrate to their clients that they've had someone come audit them and that they have sound internal controls in place. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead because we are going to be doing some podcasts in the future that will go into the different types of SOC reporting, but we'll also discuss some information security compliance frameworks and how one might gain assurance that those things are in place at a vendor. But just know that it's a useful mechanism for customers to keep their vendors accountable, but also on the other side of the coin, it's a good way for vendors to demonstrate to their customers that they've got sound internal controls in place and can, in fact, protect sensitive data. Jesus, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention?
Not that we haven't covered, but I would just like to close that every company out there already has the tools in place. The right to audit and the contract review also apply the logic internally. Look at your controls. Look at your IT folks. Ask them what they're doing to make sure the tools are deployed correctly. Look at it as an internal risk assessment or an internal audit. That will help. Most of these scenarios that we discussed, if they've gone through those internal reviews, you might have seen some of these items and stayed out of the news.
Yeah, that's very good advice. So, Jesus, I want to thank you for joining us today. For everyone listening, I'd like to encourage you to stay tuned. We will have some podcasts in the future that'll discuss some more elements of cybersecurity risk and in particular managing third-party risk. But for now, I want to thank you for listening and have a good day.